pleasure to introduce Dr. Brian Hochman. Today, he is an assistant professor in the Department of English, just nearby at Georgetown University. He received his PhD in American Studies from Harvard in 2011, and he is the author of a fabulous book entitled Savage Preservations, the Ethnographic Origins of Modern Media Technology, along with several articles and book chapters. I have this book here. It was published in 2014, and published in 2014, Savage Preservation was a finalist for the Laura Ramono First Book Publication Prize for American Studies. And in the book, Brian draws on a vast array of archival sources, many of them here in this institution, which was one of the reasons why I wanted to bring him to talk to you all, and elsewhere, to explore the conjoined history of documentation of so-called primitive races that our department and many other areas were fascinated with in the 19th century, and who many at the time thought were in danger of disappearing. And this history of looking at that is conjoined with the development of media technologies. And in the book, he traces this conjoined history and really argues how the two fascinations with technology and with this disappearance and need for documentation kind of conjoined and influenced one another. And in the process, tracing it through to the 21st century, to the 20th century, I think he provides a really nice and new media-rich interpretation of the origins of ethnography. And for us, the role of the museum, the media, etc. So without further ado, thank you, Brian, for coming.
Okay, so thanks so much, Josh, for inviting me, and thanks to all of you for taking the time out of your day to come here. I appreciate it more than I can say, particularly because I know that this is a busy time of the year for all of us. It's really an honor to be here at NMNH. The Smithsonian was essentially where my book began. So I think it's only fitting that I'm here now, a year after the book's release, talking about it again. Needless to say, this is a project that would have been impossible were it not for the fantastic materials that are held here and the even more fantastic archivists who care for them and know so much about them. And I think this might be something of an overdramatic gesture, but I want to dedicate this talk to those people. Some of them are actually in the audience. And I really can't express my gratitude in any other way. I'm going to do two different things today. The first, I'm going to tell a story to help introduce you all to Savage Preservation, the book that's brought me here. And then I'm going to launch into a broader meditation on the ephemerality of recording media, a subject that I suspect will have a great deal of resonance for many of you, given that we're here at one of the great archival institutions in the world. So without further ado, I'll begin. In March of 1890, an ethnologist at Harvard University named Jesse Walter Fuchs left his home in Boston for a 5-day research expedition to Calais, Maine, one of the easternmost points in the continental United States. The purpose of the trip was to document the language and music of the Passamaquoddy tribe, who had for centuries called the region surrounding Calais home. According to Fuchs, the Passamaquoddy were, quote, the purest-blooded race of Indians in New England, a marooned nation within a nation. Yet their way of life appeared to have reached a dire crossroads as the century drew to a close. There are stories, rituals, songs, even the remnants of languages which once extended over great states, which are now known only to a few persons, Fuchs explained in the pages of Science Journal. These persons are, in some instances, old men and old women, he continued, with whose death they will disappear forever from the face of the earth if some record is not now made of them. Many have already been lost forever, even in the last 20 years, and some are fated to disappear forever. Time, in other words, seemed perilously short. The Passamaquoddy, Fuchs claimed, were, quote, rapidly losing their former character. Soon they would fade into the misty recesses of history. Many Americans, like Fuchs, who came of age in the decades following the Civil War, many who witnessed the genocidal advance of U.S. Indian policy, and many who envisioned an empire for liberty stretching into distant overseas territories. Many believed that cultural groups like the Passamaquoddy were fated to pass away. In 1890, the myth of the vanishing Indian was as widespread as it was flawed, already something of a hallowed cliche in the United States. But Fuchs's efforts among the Passamaquoddy added a slightly unexpected twist to the tale. On his trip to Calais, he brought paper for taking notes and pencils for drawing diagrams, as well as a leather-bound diary that he planned on using as the basis for a series of published articles. He also brought a phonograph, a rotary treadle, and a box of 40 wax cylinders. Now, invented just 2 years prior, the cylinder phonograph was no ordinary tool of the ethnographic trade. But when Fuchs arrived in Calais, he met two Passamaquoddy tribal elders, Noel Josephs and Peter Selmore, who were eager to see if his newfangled recording machine could preserve what they called the old customs for posterity. The three men worked together for several days, proceeding mostly by trial and error. While Fuchs cranked the cylinders, cautiously putting needle to wax and converting sound into history, Josephs and Selmore took turns talking directly into the bell of the phonograph horn. They recorded 6 Passamaquoddy tales, 6 Passamaquoddy songs, and a number of routine conversations in the Passamaquoddy language. They also recited the Passamaquoddy numerals from 1 to 20, the days of the week, and an extended list of words and phrases that corresponded to the vocabulary schedule provided in the U.S. Bureau of Ethnology's Introduction to the Study of Indian Languages, published 13 years prior in 1877. All told, Josephs and Selmore filled 35 of the 40 cylinders that Fuchs brought with him. I might fill many hundreds, Fuchs conceded in a letter home from Calais. But the present work is only an experiment, and I must limit my work to a superficial examination of the subject. When Fuchs returned to Boston, he began writing a series of journal articles that promoted his experimental cylinder recordings and defended the value of new sound technologies. He boldly predicted that the phonograph was destined to find its most lasting social use in the ethnographic arena, preserving the dying sounds of disappearing cultures the world over. Now is the time to collect material before all is lost, he insisted. The phonetic or written methods now in use are good, but phonograph records are easier to make and much more satisfactory. For Fuchs, the future of the Passamaquoddy was to be written on wax rather than on paper. As he concluded, Thomas Edison has given us an instrument by which our fast-fading Aborigines and Aboriginal language can be rescued from oblivion, and it seems to me that posterity will thank us if we use it. History, we now know, would prove his predictions both right and wrong. So Fuchs's trip to record the Passamaquoddy in March of 1890 offers us a compelling image, celebrated in the annals of media history as the first known use of the phonograph in the context of ethnographic fieldwork, although there's some debate around whether Fuchs was in fact the first. Like many of the famous firsts on which we rely to distinguish revolutionary moments of media change, the Passamaquoddy experiment performs important ideological work in the present, upholding the relationship between technological invention and cultural use as natural, even necessary, when the historical record tells, in fact, a far less tidy story. In truth, the cylinder phonograph wasn't an easy or even obvious solution to the problem of the vanishing Indian. Early recording machines were unreliable and difficult to operate, nowhere more so than in remote field locations. Wax cylinders were notoriously prone to deterioration, deforming when exposed to heat and wearing out when subjected to excessive use. And then there was the issue, of course, of cost. In 1890, the cylinder phonograph was a prohibitively expensive piece of equipment, an exorbitant purchase, certainly for any scientist like Fuchs working on a shoestring budget. After taking stock of the technology's possibilities and shortcomings, after weighing the miracle of sound reproduction against the material and economic realities that constrained its cultural application, the majority of Fuchs's contemporaries in the growing field of anthropology had actually dismissed the phonograph as, quote, too imperfect to be of any value. Now, it's easy to overlook all of this. Accustomed as we are to living in a world in which technologies of all sorts seamlessly store and deliver the content of culture, the contingencies, the real historical contingencies of Fuchs's interest in the phonograph generally remain lost on us today. The disorienting fact of history is that the Passamaquoddy experiment wasn't an inevitable product of the so-called acoustical marvel of modern sound reproduction, as 19th century commentators had first deemed it. In context, Fuchs's phonographic errand into the wilderness was a hedged bet, a calculated response to the growing scientific consensus that human groups differed according to behaviors and beliefs, and that the variations among them determined their ability to survive and progress over time. Like the photographic image before it, and like the cinematic image to come, the cylinder recording had a future in the United States, according to Fuchs, because it offered a, quote, practical and efficient way for the civilized to prevent the savage from vanishing into obsolescence. The sentiment was more of a wish than a reality, but for Fuchs, this much was certain. The problem of race and the promise of media were inextricably linked. So the book that has brought me here today, Savage Preservation, explains why men and women like Fuchs understood new technologies like the phonograph in these terms, examining the surprising connections between thinking about race and thinking about media in late 19th and early 20th century America. During this period, writers and anthropologists believed that historical forces had pushed the world's primitive cultures to the brink of extinction. They also believed that films, photographs, and phonograph recordings, modern media then in their historical infancy, were uniquely suited to capture and preserve primitive life before it disappeared forever. Savage Preservation uncovers how the modern impulse to record cultures directly influenced audiovisual innovation, experimentation, and use in the United States, tracing the parallel histories of race and media, ethnography, and technology during this crucial period of transition. And I should add a period of transition that closely resembles our own, a connection that I'll get to in a second. My central contention is that the rush to document the world's peoples at the end of the 19th century, of which Fuchs's trip to Calais was but one instance, of course, of many. This helped many Americans come to terms not just with the realities of human difference, but with the audiovisual technologies that by the turn of the 20th century had increasingly come to mediate them. New media like photography, phonography, and cinema provided the tools to popularize the discipline of anthropology in the United States. And at the same time, the anthropological crusade to record races and cultures in the face of their extinction, what scholars have long called salvage ethnography, provided both an ideological framework and a material occasion to experiment with the social possibilities of new media. In the end, the project of cultural preservation catalyzed debates that would shape the contours of media culture in 20th century America. Debates about permanence and obsolescence, progress and stasis, truth and fiction, the primitive and the modern. In short, and this is the book's main argument, the main contention, the origins of modern media in the United States are distinctly ethnographic. So, the book examines this confluence of relationships in case studies on efforts to preserve Native American languages, both signed and spoken, on attempts to record ancient songs and spirituals on the cylinder phonograph, like Fuchs's, and on the popular histories of color photography and ethnographic cinema in the early decades of the 20th century. But rather than rehearse one of these case studies for you here today, I'd like to consider in the remaining time what such a history might mean for us in the contemporary moment. What became of Fuchs's predictions about vanishing races and new media technologies? Did the Passamaquoddy indeed disappear as he believed, as he prophesied in 1890? And did the wax cylinders he made end up serving as their final resting place? The best place to begin answering these questions is to consider Language Keepers, an ongoing digital media project that uses documentary film and descriptive linguistics to restore many of the Passamaquoddy traditions that interested Fuchs in the early years of the phonograph. Established in 2006 by Ben Levine and Robert M. Levitt, a filmmaker and a linguist who have worked under the guidance of Passamaquoddy tribal representatives for well over a decade, Language Keepers aims to record the Passamaquoddy Maliseet language as it sounds today. And more broadly, the project works to create an online infrastructure for cultural revitalization in the contemporary Passamaquoddy community. According to Levine and Levitt, the main idea behind Language Keepers is to create a, quote, self-sustaining documentation resource online so that cultural groups whose heritage languages are at risk can eventually become self-documenting, an aim that I'm sure most of us here are familiar, if not sympathetic with, given the mission of the Smithsonian's Recovering Voices initiative. So the cornerstone of the Language Keepers project is the Passamaquoddy Maliseet language portal, www.pmportal.org, an online database that allows internet users to access an 18,000-word heritage language dictionary and a growing archive of documentary videos featuring native speakers in everyday conversation. Because Levine, Levitt, and their collaborators recognize Passamaquoddy Maliseet as a living language, one of the oldest in North America, in fact, the portal also allows users to add content to the digital archive, providing a way for community members to document their own culture and stimulate heritage language use in everyday settings. Since its inception in 2006, Language Keepers has received funding from several high-profile government agencies, including the National Science Foundation and the National Endowment for the Humanities' Documenting Endangered Languages program. And along with Levine and Levitt, the Passamaquoddy hope that their successes in the digital arena will spark similar initiatives across among Native American communities across the United States. A program that should be familiar, again, in spirit to some that you may be working with here. So at first glance, Language Keepers seems to embody a contemporary update of Fuchs's documentary project of 1890, a new brand of salvage ethnography for the digital age. Upon closer inspection, however, the initiative represents a comprehensive rejection of the salvage paradigm. For one thing, as Levine and Levitt explain, what makes the language portal unique is that it encourages, quote, speaker groups to use heritage language in traditional and contemporary activities while recording it for language learning, dictionary development, research, cultural transmission, and revival. In other words, the online archive functions as a creative platform for the persistence of Passamaquoddy culture, rather than a technological memorial to its expected extinction. Moreover, the language portal is as much the product of the Native community's efforts as it is the product of Levine's documentary filmmaking and Levitt's linguistic research. Where Fuchs's experiments in Calais sought to mask the collaborative nature of the ethnographic encounter, hiding behind the invented objectivity of wax cylinders and talking machines. And this is an issue that I talk about in the book's third chapter. Language Keepers, at bottom, recognizes ethnography as a shared cross-cultural endeavor, wholly contingent and perpetually unfinished. And yet, something of Fuchs's initial experiment remains here, not least of which is the fact that the architects of the Language Keepers project maintain an abiding interest in using new media technologies to capture the sounds of Passamaquoddy culture. The 1890 cylinder recordings even show up in some of the films that are currently posted online in the language portal. In one Language Keepers segment, recorded on video in 2010 and titled Let's All Sing, a group of Passamaquoddy men and women gathers for a healing ceremony, honoring members of the community who were physically abused for using their language at a religious school during the 1950s and 1960s. And you can go on pmportal.org and see this if you'd like. After capturing a short discussion of the benefits of speaking the native tongue today, "It makes you feel good," exclaims one voice off camera. The footage begins with Maggie Paul, a heritage speaker who appears in a number of Language Keepers videos, launching into a powerful version of a traditional Passamaquoddy song that celebrates the vital role of commerce in the community's long history. It's known as the Passamaquoddy trading song. At first, the group is hesitant to join in. Several of the women on camera protest that they can no longer recall the melody. But soon they add their voices to the chorus, matching the strength of Maggie Paul's refrain and tapping along with the urgent beat of her drum. At the completion of the performance, the men and women in the video smile and laugh together, wondering where Maggie first learned the tune. Her reply, translated in subtitles in the video, is as poignant as it is telling. "We got that song long ago when they first made those, what are they called, wax tapes?" Here she falters, momentarily forgetting the name of the technology in question, searching for the correct term in both Passamaquoddy Maliseet and English. Wax cylinders," a voice off-screen interjects. "Yes, wax cylinders, that's where we got that song," she replies, memory restored. Maggie Paul, in short, had learned her version of the Passamaquoddy trading melody from a copy of Fuchs's cylinder recordings. To be sure, this is an outcome that overturns the narratives of culture and history that Fuchs and his 19th century contemporaries regarded as fact. Put simply, the sounds and the people who made them were supposed to have disappeared, gradually receding into the shadows of history. At least that was the assumption that had brought Fuchs to Calais in March of 1890, phonograph in tow. His field notes from the expedition describe the Passamaquoddy trading song as part of a very old trading custom that few members of the community practiced at the time. A person singing a song goes to the wigwam and then knocks and enters, he jotted in his diary in 1890. Then, dancing around for some time and singing, he asks for something which he seeks in trade. The occupant or owner is obliged to close the entrance or give something of equal value in exchange. Each trader is closed in the old fashion, and the song is given on cylinder 17. According to Fuchs's notes, the exchange ceremony had begun to fall out of favor among members of the Passamaquoddy community who lived in the region surrounding Calais in the preceding decades. Writing in the Journal of American Folklore a few months later, after his return to Boston, he predicted that the trading dance and the song that accompanied it were soon to be, quote, wholly lost or greatly modified. Yet, as Maggie Paul explains in Language Keepers 120 years later, the Passamaquoddy trading song was in fact alive and well in the mid-1980s, when magnetic copies of Cylinder 17 began circulating among members of the Passamaquoddy community. Beneath the pulsating hiss and crackle of Fuchs's recording, degraded over the course of a century, the Passamaquoddy knew exactly what they were hearing when they encountered the trading song on tape almost a century later. We kept listening to it, Maggie tells the group in the film. We kept listening to it for so long, we didn't know for how long, but finally we could make it out. It sounded so wonderful, didn't it? Now, Maggie Paul's rhetorical question offers us, I think, two important lessons about the histories of race and media in the period between Fuchs's Passamaquoddy experiment in 1890 and present. And I think it's worth considering both at length. First off, to underscore a point that is perhaps already self-evident, Maggie Paul's story of musical persistence disproves the predictions about native cultural disappearance that American writers and anthropologists made at the end of the 19th century. In the process, it also reveals the contingency of the documentary records that they left behind, their vulnerability to reinterpretation and change over time. Today, the Passamaquoddy regard Fuchs's phonograph cylinders not as relics of technological experimentation or as documents of social exploitation, but as enduring evidence of cultural vitality, as a usable past that lives on in the present. Salvage ethnography thus remains a, quote, potent ideological force in our current moment, as the historian Pauline Wakin has argued, but not as its turn-of-the-century practitioners would have ever anticipated. Over the last 30 years, the rediscovery of early ethnographic recordings, photographs, and films has enabled Native communities across the United States to transmit valuable cultural knowledge from one generation to the next. Ethnographic documents that were once languishing in obscurity have been reclaimed, or really salvaged, to fashion new meanings in the present. Maggie Paul's story of the wax tapes is more common than we might at first think. During the late 1970s and early 1980s, in conjunction with the passage of the American Folklife Preservation Act in 1976 and the inauguration of the Federal Cylinder Project, or FCP, scores of Native Americans had the experience of recognizing sounds of their ancestors on recordings that American ethnologists originally made at the turn of the 20th century. Formally chartered in 1979, the FCP was given the formidable task of cataloging over 8,000 salvaged ethnographic recordings, copying them onto state-of-the-art preservation formats, and essentially repatriating them to their original individual tribes of origin. Over the years, the project has acquired a dual significance in Native communities across the United States. At the same time that it serves as an ongoing reminder of a cultural past ripe for recovery in an uncertain present, it also serves as a material marker of persistence and change over time. According to one of the FCP's field workers who's sitting here today, during the 1980s, Native Americans who were, quote, knowledgeable in the traditions of their communities often found it possible to sing along when they first listened to the repatriated cylinders, suggesting that, again, quoting, despite all of the acculturation pressures over the years, the traditions, the songs have, in fact, survived. And while many of the songs and stories that early salvage ethnographers recorded remain recognizable in the present day, others have been altered in the intervening century, rearranged for new occasions and reimagined for new realities. Wayne Newell and Blanche Sakabason, two award-winning Passamaquoddy musicians who appear in several Language Keepers videos, know a great deal about the FCP and its legacy. At a concert held at the American Folklife Center in 2009, Newell and Sakabasin sang an updated version of the so-called Snake Song that Fuchs originally captured on wax in March of 1890. As the musicians were quick to remind the audience, and this performance is as well available online for anyone who wants to see it, the Snake Song had, quote, evolved into something that it wasn't previously in the long interim between Fuchs's recording and their 2009 performance. Excuse me. This is the Snake Song that we sing now, Newell remarked in between musical numbers. It is now used to close a gathering rather than open a gathering. But long ago, another song was used to gather people in the village for a celebration or ceremony, and over time, it has changed its purpose. In other words, the tunes transform with the times, and so do the people who sing them. But this doesn't necessarily mean that the old traditions, captured on record by Fuchs and repatriated by the FCP, have no utility in the present. As Newell went on to explain, sorry, I'm a little under the weather now, excuse me. Several members of the community were studying copies of Fuchs's recordings in order to reincorporate the original version of the Snake Song into contemporary Passamaquoddy gatherings. The old song is being learned now to excuse me, to replace this new version as part of the snake dance. A year ago, a group of men in our community learned the song and danced in and surprised the children as part of the snake dance song. These wax cylinders are being worked on at home by speakers of the language so that we can resurrect older songs that were recorded by our people more than 100 years ago. Fuchs, in other words, claimed the music was dying in 1890. But Newell's account underscores that the songs are still alive in one form or another over a century later, as much the result of creative cultural adaptation as of deliberate historical recovery. The same could be said, I think, for Maggie Paul's performance in Language Keepers, a fact that I discovered when I first listened to Fuchs's original recording of the Passamaquoddy trading song a few years ago. Along with the rest of the materials associated with the legendary phonograph experiments of 1890, a magnetic copy of Fuchs's Cylinder 17 currently resides in the collections of the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress. In August of 2013, I decided to go and hear it for myself. After braving the late summer humidity and navigating the lengthy corridors of the library's Thomas Jefferson building, I arrived at the Folklife Center and introduced myself to a longtime archivist named Judith Gray, again seated here today, one of the original members of the FCP. When I told her I wanted to listen to a few of the Passamaquoddy recordings, she led me to a corner of the library outfitted with a reel-to-reel deck, and she rushed off to retrieve the relevant holdings. She returned a few minutes later to find me somewhat embarrassed. I had absolutely no idea how to use the audio equipment, a detail that I'll return to in a moment, and she spent the next few minutes patiently teaching me how to work the profusion of spools and dials on the machine. And the other researchers at the center, clearly more experienced than I, looked on in something that resembled mild amusement. It took me a while to find the exact location of Cylinder 17 on the FCP's magnetic reel, but when I finally did, I was puzzled. On the 1890 recording, Fuchs's voice clearly identifies the trading song in question, but the singing that follows his introduction is barely audible. What little I could hear fading in and out of the staticky old recording sounded slow, low, and mournful, completely different in any event from the upbeat and dynamic rendition I knew from Language Keepers. Had Fuchs made a mistake in 1890, or worse yet, had Maggie Paul misremembered where she first learned the trading song? My questions were eventually answered after I fiddled with the dials on the deck and listened to the recording a few more times. The tune and the mood were different. The sound quality had suffered over the years. But suddenly I began to hear faint outlines of the trading song beneath all of the distortion, a ghostly ancestor from a different time. Only then did I realize that I'd been thinking like Fuchs. I came to the Folklife Center with a preconceived notion that Passamaquoddy music was something singular and fixed, naively assuming a perfect line of musical continuity between the two versions of the song. But the 1890 recording ended up frustrating these expectations, and not just because of its diminished sound quality. In retrospect, what I heard in the magnetic copy of Fuchs's Cylinder 17 was an audible symptom of change over time. Like many Passamaquoddy singers before her, Maggie Paul had reinterpreted the original rendition of the trading song for her own purposes, for the occasion of the healing ceremony, for the interest of the Language Keepers footage, and for an unrecorded future to come. Her performance, captured online, suggests that the Passamaquoddy haven't remained static in the 125 years between Fuchs's experiment and today. Their culture is perpetually in process, forever remaking the remnants of the past for the exigencies of the present. For this reason, the songs have ended up outliving the cylinder recordings that were originally thought to serve as their final resting place. And this brings us to the second lesson of Language Keepers, and the real point of my talk here. A lesson about the realities of media permanence in an age defined by accelerated cultural change and continuous technological innovation. In the 1890s, at a time when the phonograph's social future was largely uncertain, Fuchs listened to his experimental recordings and predicted that the songs of the Passamaquoddy tribe would live forever in the grooves of the wax cylinder. Yet when Maggie Paul first encountered the FCP's copy of Cylinder 17 a century later, she had to fight through noise and distortion in order to recognize the trading song that members of her community had been singing for years. We kept listening to it for so long, we didn't know for how long, but finally we could make it out. This is how she explains where she learned it, and other people recognized it. Of course, I had the exact same experience when I first heard the Folklife Center's magnetic transfers of the Passamaquoddy cylinders. The recordings were riddled with unpredictable jumps and murky fades. At times, in the case of Cylinder 17 in particular, the hiss and static in my headphones drowned out the songs that ethnologists of the late 1800s considered to be salvaged for posterity. Where Fuchs initially heard the embodied presence of a disappearing cultural source, Maggie Paul and I initially heard little more than noise. So what exactly has Cylinder 17 preserved over the years? This isn't an easy question to answer. Standards of sound fidelity have changed a great deal since the end of the 19th century, and many of the difficulties that contemporary researchers face when listening to copies of Fuchs's recordings have a lot to do with the limitations of the device that he used in the field. However, as scholars like Christopher Ann Patton and Jonathan Stern more recently have pointed out, the auditory imperfections that make some early recordings more difficult to decipher than others are also a direct result of the deterioration of the audio formats on which they were made. Wax cylinders like the ones Fuchs used in Calais were notorious, as I mentioned earlier, for their material fragility. Excessive use caused phonograph recordings to fade over time, and improper storage techniques, exposure to heat and humidity in particular, only served to exacerbate the problem. Lest we think that this isn't a problem that we've that this is a problem that we've overcome since the 1890s, subsequent audio formats have proven no less susceptible to long-term decay. Acetate records often suffer from a condition known as delamination. Plastic, glass, and tinfoil formats are easily scratched and deformed, and many other audio materials have ended up playing unsuspected hosts in archives to destructive colonies of mold and fungi. Magnetic tape, once the gold standard for long-term audio preservation, generally allows no more than 25 years of use before it begins to wear down, a shorter lifespan than that of an ordinary sheet of paper. Virtually all sound recordings are degraded by playback, Patton notes, echoing what many preservation archivists have been saying for centuries. None of the instantaneous formats, and this is Patton, who is himself an archivist, as he says in his article, none of the instantaneous formats can be shelved for permanent storage as paper can. All require regular attention and still will deteriorate fairly quickly to the point that re-recording is always necessary. Like most early sound recordings then, Cylinder 17 began its slow march into inaudibility as soon as Fuchs began studying the results of his phonographic experiment in the 1890s. While a number of early audio ethnographers had the foresight to duplicate their cylinders in the 1920s and 1930s, the Passamaquoddy recordings had a less fortunate fate, spending the better part of a century gathering dust on the shelves of Harvard University's Peabody Museum. When the cylinders finally made their way to the Library of Congress in the early 1970s, archivists could only hope to safeguard against further deterioration by migrating what was left of Fuchs's work onto magnetic reels. Now, such stories of duplication and reduplication are, of course, common in the lives of early sound recordings, with preservation transfers occurring about once every 4 decades. In the case of cylinder 17, it's a story that would have ended more happily if archivists had recognized the long-term instability of Fuchs's cylinders when they arrived at the Peabody Museum 4 decades after they were first made, and if open reel magnetic tape, had itself lived up to its billing as a permanent storage format 4 decades after the LOC made its last-ditch preservation transfer. Today, the contents of Fuchs's cylinder 17, now known as Reel 4260 in the American Folk Life Center's collection, are barely intelligible. Digital innovations provide a great deal of hope for solving the age-old problem of format deterioration. For example, the MacArthur Award-winning physicist Carl Haber has pioneered a way to reconstruct sound recordings that were never even playable in the first place. And I'm sure you've all heard of his work and the so-called Irene method that he's made famous. Really astonishing work that he's done. However, given the crowded graveyard of audio technologies that lies behind us, it seems entirely likely that we'll end up facing many of the same challenges with digitally reconstructed files of the Passamaquoddy cylinders 4 decades hence, and perhaps even sooner. And this should give us pause. To be sure, many of the technologies of cultural preservation that I discuss in my book went the way of Fuchs's cylinder 17 over the course of the 20th century. The 5th chapter of Savage Preservation examines early color photographs made by the so-called autochrome method that have been stored in the vaults of the National Geographic Image Collection since the 1920s. The majority of them unfortunately retain little of their original chromatic brilliance, and the digital preservation copies that photo archivists have produced over the years to preserve them clearly lack the luminous textures that viewers often noted when encountering them in the early decades of the 20th century. Thus, and if you'll excuse the pun, while photographic breakthroughs may well have satisfied salvage ethnography's fantasy of permanent cultural preservation in the short term, time has gradually revealed a much less colorful reality. Efforts to study early ethnographic films like Robert and Francis Flaherty's Moana of 1926, an attempt to capture daily life in Samoa that I discuss in the book's 4th chapter, have similarly suffered from the physical instability of celluloid film stock. This was an obstacle that the Flahertys, pioneers, as you may know, of the documentary genre, knew all too well in their lifetime. In 1918, Robert Flaherty almost lost his life when the ashes of a careless cigarette fell on a nitrate print of the film that would eventually become their more well-known masterpiece, Nanook of the North. Viable prints of their second film, Moana, still exist, of course. In 1999, the U.S. National Film Preservation Foundation sponsored an archival restoration of an original 35mm version, currently housed at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Yet until recently, when low-quality DVDs of Moana began turning up online, my only point of visual reference for the Flaherty's 1926 film was a dim 16mm copy owned by the Harvard Film Archive, which preservation archivists appear to have transferred from a failing 35mm version sometime during the 1940s. It should come as no surprise that the visual effects of the Flaherty Samoan experiment got lost in the shuffle along the way. When I first viewed Moana in the mid-2000s, the Samoan actors and actresses who were once thought to exhibit the golden beauty of primitive beings, as the filmmaker John Grierson described the film upon its release in 1926. These were occasionally overrun by harsh overexposures and inky black shadows. Whether there was in fact a reanimated relic of a dying culture preserved in the 16mm copy that flickered and faded across my screen is difficult to say. Above all else, such stories help to remind us of the ephemerality of permanence, a paradox, a fundamental paradox of modern media history that has become increasingly conspicuous in the digital age. By almost every conceivable measure, the technologies that appear to fulfill the ethnographic fantasy of permanent cultural preservation at the turn of the 20th century have failed to withstand the basic test of time. In all likelihood, the technologies that promise fidelity and longevity today will eventually follow suit. There is no such thing as a permanent medium, in other words, and the ongoing problem of material shelf life is itself compounded by the speed at which technologies of all sorts now seem to rush toward obsolescence. While wax cylinders fall victim to mold and humidity, and while celluloid prints suffer the slow ravages of what's known as vinegar syndrome, technological loss of a higher order is allegedly taking place. If the analog hasn't disappeared yet, we're told. It will disappear soon. Print is now dying, cinema is suddenly filmless, and the age of mechanical sound reproduction is soon to become a distant memory. In short, many of the 20th century's most familiar forms of storage and communication appear to be teetering on the brink of extinction, destined to vanish into an invisible stream of ones and zeros. Or perhaps the analog is already gone, already forgotten in the age of the digital. Witness Maggie Paul's inability to remember the words wax cylinder in her story of how she learned the Passamaquoddy trading song, or my own ignorance of the workings of a reel-to-reel deck, unwitting product of the cassette tape and the compact disc, and now the MP3 that I am. The reality of history is, of course, far more complicated than the dominant narratives of media transformation would lead us to believe. Whatever significance we end up ascribing to the rise of the digital, and there is no doubt that its implications are profound and will remain so for the foreseeable future, sweeping pronouncements of the disappearance of the analog should have an eerie ring of familiarity about them. Late 19th and early 20th century anthropologists, of course, talked about races and cultures as disappearing in similar terms. To be sure, what we now regard as old media, now disappearing everywhere, have gradually emerged as the vanishing objects of the 21st century's version of the salvage ethnographic imperative. And documentary initiatives like Language Keepers are actually doing valuable work in preserving them. The vanishing races and disappearing cultures of the turn of the century period, in other words, haven't merely survived over the years. They have found innovative ways to salvage the media that were once thought to salvage them. At the dawn of the 21st century, then, we are left with a striking irony. In the 1890s, when Fuchs traveled to Calais with his cylinder phonograph, Americans firmly believed that if cultures around the world were disappearing, modern media technologies would live on to tell their tale. 120 years later, 125 years later, however, the opposite is the case. Cultures are now said to survive, media now seem to disappear. The truth, of course, lies somewhere in between these two imagined extremes. But the reversal itself testifies to powerful historical shifts, reminding us that cultures and technologies are never as permanent, never as absolute as they might seem at any given moment in time. As we race headlong into the digital age, at once hopeful and uncertain of the future to come, we will do well to keep such lessons, Fuchs's lessons, in mind. Thanks very much.